Marisha here, and today I'm going to share with you an aspect of Anglophilia that had a really big impact on my life. And I'm going to start with a story from my childhood. When I was about 12, my parents took me downtown. They went to the bank and they sent me across the street to the library to get the latest issue of Consumer Reports for them. But as soon as I walked in the library doors, the head librarian saw me, called me over to the desk, and pulled out an envelope and said almost gleefully, "Well, we were going to mail this, but now we can save a stamp." And opened the envelope, handed me the letter, and watched as I read that they were going to prosecute me if I did not return an overdue library book ASAP. Now, you can imagine that this was very distressing to me as a 12-year-old child to be threatened with legal action. And I was also confused because the book in question I had renewed. And so it wasn't due yet. And I said this to her, I was like, I thought I renewed that. And she said, well, that's not what our records show. And you're barred from using the library until this book is returned. So I couldn't get the Consumer Reports for my parents. And obviously, I'm also really upset because I'm living in a rural community before the internet, so the library is really my only access to reading materials. We don't have a bookstore. We obviously can't order books. So I'm clutching this letter and I'm in tears and I walk across the street back to my parents and tell them what happened. And they say, okay, well, we'll just go get the book. And I was like, I swear that I renewed it. And it's like, okay, we'll just get the book and we'll go from there. So I go home, get the book, open it up to the back page, and sure enough, it had been renewed. So my dad takes me back down to the library and shows them the book that had been stamped with a new due date. And it turns out that the library was in the process of converting over to a computerized system. And what they had done is they had stamped my book, but had neglected to record it in their computer. My dad rightfully gave the head librarian what for, telling her, first of all, how ridiculous it is to be threatening a child with legal action over an overdue book, especially a child from a family that's well established in the community. I think he said something to the effect of, it's not like we're going to skip town with your book. Um, and then, saying things like, well, this is a terrible way to run a library. It's supposed to be a friendly communal space, and no wonder hardly anybody comes here, and I wouldn't be surprised if she never comes back, etc. Now, you might be asking yourself at this point, well, what was the book? It was Diamonds Are Forever by Ian Fleming. And shortly after this, my dad went to another city that had a used bookstore and bought all of the Fleming novels so that I had my own set that I could read at my leisure and I could avoid the library for a while. Just for a while. This is not an anti-library post. I love libraries, fully support them, love my librarian friends. There was another librarian at that library who was a lovely lady. So don't take this to be an anti-library in any stretch of the imagination. But this is a story about the impact that Bond had on my life. So because of this incident, now I am in possession of all of the Fleming novels, and I am able to read these at my leisure and reread them if I want, um, and also obviously fully supported by my parents in reading them as a 12-year-old kid. I mean, they are adult novels and they do have adult material, but parents fully supported me reading them. Um, and it wasn't just the movies and the novels that I was into. I also had books about Bond. So I had a James Bond encyclopedia. I had another book that kind of talked about some of the behind the scenes of the films. I knew so much Bond trivia, like, what Q's real name was and M's real name and what Spectre stands for. And did you know that Maude Adams is the only actress to play two different Bond girls, etc. I mean, really, I knew way more about Bond than anybody who is not a broccoli had any business knowing. But that's because I wanted to be Bond. Um, I wanted to travel the world and eat at nice restaurants and blow things up all on the government's dime. I mean, what a great job. And so, from the time I was 11 when I saw my first Bond film until I was about a senior in high school, if people asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, the answer was a spy, right? Um, and I definitely got some looks when I said that. Um, but I was serious, and I made a lot of decisions as a middle schooler and a high schooler based on that desire. So in middle school, I was already thinking about the sort of person that I would need to be and the skills I would need to have if I was going to be a spy. And so I would put myself on like self improvement plans, and they would include a portion that was like physical and a portion that was mental. And so it would be like, oh, do this many push-ups and sit-ups. And at one point I asked my dad for a punching bag, like a speed bag. And so I had a speed bag at a pretty young age that I was working with. And then later in high school, I saved up and I bought myself like the regular, like punching bag, like the body bag. And, I would lift weights and stuff. And then on the mental side, it was really just an excuse to explore all of the things that I probably would have explored anyway. And I think that's part of Bond's appeal. One of the things that it tapped into is that I'm naturally curious about the world and interested in a wide variety of subjects. And the idea that there's this career where you might have to pretend to be different people at different times. And so you need to know a little bit about everything so you can pass as whatever. So, like in OHMSS, I think he has to pretend to be an expert in heraldry at some point, right? Things like that. It just really, again, tapped into this part of me that was already drawn to trivia and just exploring a wide variety of topics. And so I had like a little plastic box and index cards, and I would write down different interesting facts that I found and like store them in this box. Um, and then in high school, when we had to do a 4-year plan, so we had to take like an interest inventory, like a job inventory, where we filled out like what are things that we're interested in and that we're good at or whatever. And it had like a list of careers. And it didn't have every career because CIA agent was not an option, but FBI agent was. And so we had to pick one that we put down as this is, the career that I'm aspiring to. And so this is the 4-year plan that I have, the classes that I'm going to be taking over the next 4 years with that career in mind, right? Um, and for a lot of careers, it was understanding. Obviously, you have to go to college, so these are the classes that you're taking with like college in mind. And so of course, then I took all of the advanced placement classes, and I took the only foreign language that my school offered. And I would have done that anyway, I'm sure. But I do distinctly remember having to fill out that like paperwork. Every freshman had to fill out this paperwork, this 4-year plan. And talking about that, and also talking about it like with teachers. I remember once having a teacher where I told him that I wanted to be a spy, and he was like, "Why would someone with your creativity want to do that?" like, um, and he probably had a point, but at the time it sort of fell on deaf ears, because I was just so kind of enamored with this idea of what I thought being a spy was, which was, James Bond. And now, obviously, I got to a point where I learned that that's not the reality, and that really it's kind of a lot of times sort of drudgery and a lot of paperwork, and you don't actually get to blow things up very often. Um, this makes me sound like a pyromaniac, and I'm not, but just the excitement, the adventure that comes with Bond is, not nearly as prevalent, I think, in the real life of spies. Um, and so when I realized that, that's when I changed and decided, about senior year when I'm entering into college, like, okay, now I'm just gonna focus on being a writer. I had always wanted to be a writer, so it was sort of writer and spy simultaneously for several years there. And that was perfect because in my mind, well, then writer can be like my cover job, like, oh, I'm in this country to research my latest novel, but I'm also spying, sort of like how Mo Berg was a spy and a baseball player, right? Um, yeah, so I did I read about Mo Berg, and I remember doing a report in middle school on like Belle Starr and Mata Hari, and like Mata Hari was like my role model for a long time because she was a female spy and she was a dancer, because I took ballet for several years and jazz, and was really like into dance and stuff. But yeah, so I mean a lot of my formative years were spent with this idea of this is what I'm going to do with my life, and choices that I made as a result of that. I even went to criminal justice camp. the summer between my junior and senior years of high school. And that's where I learned how to fire a gun, how to rappel, how to dust for fingerprints, how to be a good witness in court, things like that. I think at that point I had sort of already decided I'm probably not going to be a spy, but I still went ahead to the camp. And I'm glad that I did. It was really fun. But even for a couple of years in college, though I had decided, like, nah, since that's not really the reality, let's just stick with writing. In the back of my mind, I was like, well, don't rule it out entirely. And so I took like a semester of karate and and wall climbing and stuff. And it wasn't until I realized that my moral compass would not allow me to be a spy because the CIA engages in torture and some other like shady things that I don't agree with morally. I think it was like, I think it might have been Abu Ghraib that was kind of solidified it for me. Like, oh no, this is like morally, I cannot do this job. Um, or well, I cannot work for this organization, right? So yeah, huge influence. And even though I'm not as big of a fan as I was, I'm still a big enough fan that I'm there at the premiere of every new film, and occasionally I'll like go on to some Bond Facebook post and post something about, what I think is the best stunt in the Bond films or whatever. Um, and I didn't realize sort of the impact that it had on me until I watched No Time to Die. So, spoiler alert for No Time to Die. Went on opening night with my friend, and at the end when he dies, I cried. And, I wiped my tears before I left the theater because I don't cry in public, and was fine. And I was in the parking lot chatting with her, and then we went our separate ways. And then I got into my car, and the drive home, I started crying again. And then the next morning on my morning run, I cried again. And I was like, man, why are you crying at this movie? Like, it's just a movie. Like, I get crying in the theater, right? Because I cry at lots of films. But the next day, what is wrong with you? And that's when I reflected on it and I realized, like, when they killed him off, it felt like the end of something. It had been such a huge part of my life, and for a while there it was actually a part of my identity. It was like, how our interests become a part of our identity. For a long time, like, Bond was one of my biggest hobbies, I guess, right? And there was a point where I phoned in to a newspaper and I got printed up in the article with my opinion on like who the best Bond was. And there was another time where I wrote a letter to Roger Ebert about one of his reviews for a Bond film. And I have very strong opinions about who the best Bond is. And I actually talked about that in a previous video that I will link here. Um, and so yeah, it was such a huge part of me. And so when they killed him off, it felt like the end of something. And I hadn't realized, I guess, the impact that it had on me until yeah, I'm crying 3 times in 2 days over this movie and asking myself why. Um, so, my love of Bond is, one of many sort of aspects of Anglophilia in my life. I talked about my Anglophilia in another video, but Bond in particular had a really big impact and continues to. First of all, like, you can't change your past. You can't change like the things that you did when you were a kid and really your formative years and the influences from that time. Like, but even now, I bought a couple of copies of Bond books here because most of my books are still back in the States. I didn't bring them over with me, um, because I used them in my dissertation because I was part of what I was writing was crime fiction. So when I was writing an essay about influences, I'm talking about Fleming. um, and it's something that I still seek out. Again, I'm not as rabid a fan as I used to be, but when I first moved over here, um, Christie's was having an auction of some Bond stuff, and before they were auctioning it off, it was open to the public to come see them. And um, one of the pieces I was really excited to see because it was the cello case from The Living Daylights, because it's my favorite film. And then shortly after that, there was a haberdashery that had a display of Bond hats, including Odd Jobs, Derby or Bowler. And then I think it was Harrods had Little Nelly on display for a while there. And that all happened in my first year moving over here, and it felt kind of fortuitous, the timing of my move, so that I could see those things. And I'm excited to see what they do with Bond and where it goes. I really hope that it's not something where I end up going, oh man, they just totally ruined something from my childhood. But um yeah, it's just I didn't, I get, like I said, didn't realize how much of an impact it was until I saw No Time to Die. And then even more so planning this video and thinking about some other ways that it impacted me. So, like, subscribe, tell your friends how gnarly this channel is, and I'll see you next time.